Chris and I just want to welcome you all to our 5th Annual Health Policy Summit. For those of you who don't know, this is our Center for Health Policy's 5th Annual Health Policy Summit. We would like to welcome our returning members, our returning audience, and especially any new audience members that we have here today. Every year, our Center for Health Policy has a summit where we choose a couple of pressing, interesting health policy issues for Missouri, and we bring in keynote speakers, and then we bring in Missouri experts on those topics and have a very interactive summit around these issues. So as you listen today, write your questions down because you'll all have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the talks. We'll have a couple microphones that get passed around the room, so rest assured you'll have an opportunity to be heard. Our Center for Health Policy is a nonpartisan resource center for our policymakers and lawmakers, and this summit is part of our function that we conduct every year. A little bit about logistics. I'd ask all of you to turn off your cell phones and pagers, if you don't mind, or put them on silent or vibratory. And the bathrooms are just right outside and down the hall to the left. And also, please pay attention to your evaluations today, because we really read those evaluations and try to respond to them. The mental health topic this morning really came from evaluations of our previous summits, and so please think about that, think about what you'd like to hear about in the future, and let us know. Okay.
It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker today. And like Karen said, this came from some suggestions from last year that the group would like to see some focus on mental health. And so we have a tremendous keynote speaker and then an interesting and diverse panel to talk to us about mental health this morning. But I'm going to introduce Pete Earley. He is a former reporter with the Washington Post, and he's been a journalist for approximately 30-some years, and he's written 8 nonfiction books and 3 novels. His first book, Family of Spies, was about the John Walker spy ring, and that was made into a 5-hour miniseries CBS television show. He spoke to all the members of the spy ring, the only journalist to be able to do so, and that particular book made it to 9th on the paperback bestseller list for the New York Times. His other book, Circumstantial Evidence, helped free a wrongly accused man from Alabama's death row. While writing Hot House about the Leavenworth prison, Mr. Earley spent a year inside maximum security penitentiary as a reporter doing research, and got some very fascinating stories about that, but we'll keep him on mental health this morning, although the two are clearly overlapping. His current book is labeled Crazy, A Father's Search to America's Mental Health Madness, and really tells 2 different stories. The first is about Mr. Early's struggle to get help for his college-age son after he's diagnosed with a serious mental illness. The second story describes what Mr. Earley discovered during a 9-month investigation of the Miami-Dade County Jail, where he followed prisoners with mental health problems through the justice system and into the community to observe what services were available to them. Crazy was one of 2 finalists for the 2006 Pulitzer Prizes in nonfiction. He's been described by Washingtonian Magazine as one of the handful of journalists in America who have the power to introduce new ideas and give them currency. And more than 1 million copies of his book are in print. And so I'll sort of go off script here and just tell you, here's your book, and I'll be happy to show it to anyone that's interested in it. I started reading this several months ago in preparation, because it often takes me a long time to read books because of my other responsibilities, but it didn't take me long to read this one. I got through this in just a couple of days. It's a fascinating story, very easy to read, quite accessible, and just incredibly powerful story of his son in the Miami County jail system and the community resources down there. And so I would encourage, and this is, you're not supposed to plug this, I don't think, but maybe I can. So I'm going to, so I just found a very powerful book, and I would encourage everyone to pick this up. So with that, I want to welcome Mr. Pete Earley to the podium.
Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I really appreciate it. I was looking through your conference portfolio there, looking at some of your backgrounds, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here this morning because many of you are on the front lines, and you're the shakers and the movers when it comes to mental health policy and health policy in general. So I am thrilled to be here. I'm here today as a journalist, and I'm here today as an author. But I've really come to talk to you this morning as a father, to add my story to the many stories of mental illness, to add my face to the many faces of mental illness. And my story begins with a frantic car ride and my son saying these words, "Dad, how would you feel if someone you loved killed himself?" My son, college-age son Mike, and I were speeding down Interstate 95, racing from Manhattan to Fairfax County, Virginia, where I live, when he asked me that question. Mike had been diagnosed a year earlier with a mental illness, bipolar disorder. There was no warning about what was about to happen. A year earlier, a psychiatrist had put Mike on antipsychotic medication, but my son had stopped taking his pills. When I picked him up in New York earlier that morning, he'd been wandering around Manhattan for 5 days. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. He was convinced that God was sending him on a secret mission. And during our ride to Virginia, Mike would laugh one minute and then begin sobbing and telling me he was in intense pain the next minute. I pleaded with him to take his medication, but my son screamed, "Pills are poison, pills are poison," and refused. So I silently prayed, "Hang on, son. The doctors will know how to bring you back to me." The intake nurse rolled her eyes while Mike talked gibberish about how God had him on this special mission. And then we were taken to a waiting room, which is exactly what we did for the next 4 hours. Finally, my son said, "I've had enough. I'm done. I want to leave." I said, hang on. And I raced out and I flagged down a doctor. And I will never forget how that doctor entered the room. He came in with his hands up as if he were surrendering. And he said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Earley, I can't help your son. You haven't even examined him," I said. It didn't matter. The nurse had told the doctor that my son believed all pills were poison, and under Virginia's commitment laws, no one could be required to take medication or enter any kind of treatment until they were in imminent danger, either to themselves or someone else. And the fact that Mike and I had been sitting in a waiting room for 4 hours without anyone getting hurt was proof that he was not dangerous. So the doctor turned to me and he said, "Mr. Earley, you bring your son back after he tries to kill you or he tries to kill someone else." Now, during the next 48 hours, I watched my son sink deeper and deeper into a mental abyss. At one point, he had tinfoil wrapped around his head as he was watching TV because he didn't want the CIA to read his thoughts. He slipped out of my house early one morning, and he broke into a stranger's house to take a bubble bath. Luckily, no one was there. It took an attack dog and 5 police officers to get him out of that house, and they took him to a community treatment center, and they called me. And when I raced over, an officer was waiting outside, and he said, "Mr. Earley, even though your son was clearly psychotic, even though he's told us he's been hospitalized in the past, even though he's told us that he used to take medication and they apparently helped, unless you go inside and you tell the psychiatrist in there that your son has threatened to kill you, you still will not meet Virginia's imminent danger criteria, and we'll take him to jail rather than take him to a hospital." "But he hasn't threatened to kill me," I said, and the officer walked away. So I paused for a moment, and then I went inside and I lied. I said my son had threatened to kill me, and that was good enough to get Mike taken to a hospital, where 48 hours later he voluntarily committed himself at a hearing. But our problems were far from over. 24 hours after my son was admitted into the hospital, I received a telephone call from his doctor. His insurance company wanted my son released. They considered him not an imminent danger. So I called the insurance company, but I got nowhere until I happened to mention that I used to work at the Washington Post and that I was a good friend of Mike Wallace with 60 Minutes. Now, journalists are not supposed to use their connections to bully people, but I did. And my son was allowed to stay in that hospital for a record-breaking 14 days. In the short time between our trip from New York to Mike's hospitalization, I had lied to get him into treatment, and I violated my ethics to keep him there. And just when I thought nothing could get worse, I received a call from the Fairfax County Police. Mike was being charged with 2 felonies, breaking and entering and destruction of property. I was so frustrated. Virginia laws had stopped me from getting my son help when he was clearly ill, and now they wanted to punish him for a crime he'd committed when he was not thinking clearly. I just feel so helpless, I told my wife Patty one night. I want to help our son, but I don't know what to do. Then do what you do best, she said. Pete Earley, the father, can't find out much. But Pete Earley, a reporter, can investigate this. Try to figure out what's going on today in the mental health field. So I decided to do a little preliminary digging, and I discovered that what was happening to my son was not an aberration. It was not some freak occurrence. Right now, as we're sitting here in Missouri, there are 365,000 people with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and major depression in our jails and prisons. There are 500,000 on probation. 700,000 a year go through the criminal justice system. And as many of you know, the largest public mental facility in the United States today is not a hospital. It's the Los Angeles County Jail. Now, those statistics gave me an idea, but before I pursued it, I wanted to talk to my son. Mike, I'm thinking about writing a book about what happened to you. Do you think anyone would really want to read that? He told me. I outlined my plan. I'd find a jail far away from Fairfax County because I didn't want to risk irritating the judge or the prosecutor or the defense attorney. Far away from my son's case. I'd find this jail, and I'd go in. And I'd follow 5 or 6 people who were clearly psychotic through the criminal justice system out into the street to see what kind of treatment services were available to them. Then I'd come back and I'd talk to correctional officers and judges and prosecutors and civil defense attorneys and mental health care providers and parents and consumers, and I'd try to make some sense of all of it. If it helps someone else, my son told me, then Dad, tell my story. Now, I began my investigation in Los Angeles. That makes sense. It's the largest public mental facility, and I lasted 2 days before they threw me out, citing HIPAA violations. I tried Chicago next, and they said no. Then I tried Rikers Island, New York. They said no. I tried Baltimore. They said no. I tried Washington, D.C., and they actually said hell no. My investigation eventually led me to the dreaded 9th floor of the Miami-Dade County Jail, where the most psychotic prisoners are housed. And I want to try to take you in there with me for a moment. I remember stepping in C wing, the suicide wing, for the very first time. It's a U-shaped cell block. All the cells have glass cell fronts. The correctional officers walk up and down in the center. And I remember as a reporter trying to take in every sight and every sound and every smell that was before me. When I looked into these 19 cells, I saw deranged men naked in these cells with nothing else in them. The air was filled with disgusting human smells, and because of a design flaw, the air in the cells was kept cold, bone-chilling cold, but there were no blankets. Many of the men squatted in the corner of their cells, shivering. Others drank out of toilets. Now, I heard the normal jail sounds of men chatting and coughing and spitting and hacking and toilets flushing and correctional officers laughing. But when I listened closer, I could hear the asylum sounds. "Arg!" one inmate screamed, and then I heard a thud, 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 then faster, thud, 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 then louder, thud, thud, thud. He was smashing his forehead into the glass cell, breaking his forehead open. "I ain't crazy," he screamed. "Then quit acting like you is," the unconcerned correctional officer called back. The officers who worked on this floor called it the forgotten floor. And when I got to know these officers, I found out that not one of them had received any kind of training to deal with persons with mental illness. And when I got to know them better, they all told me that every one of them thought they'd been assigned to work with the crazies because their bosses wanted them to quit. They were being sent down as punishment in hopes that they would quit their job. My tour guide in the jail was Dr. Joseph Poitier, a compassionate and wonderful psychiatrist with an impossible job. A lot of people think someone who's mentally ill is going to get help if they're put in jail, Dr. Poitier told me. But the truth is, we don't help many people here with their psychosis. We can't. We're a jail. We're not a hospital. I went with him on his morning rounds. There were 92 inmates on the 9th floor. His rounds took us 19 and a half minutes. Do the math. That's 12.7 seconds per inmate. During the next 10 months, I shadowed several inmates through the Miami legal system out into the streets. One of the first I want to tell you about is named Alice Ann Collier. She had chronic schizophrenia. She'd been homeless for a decade. She lived in the streets of South Beach. She called her home a cardboard box next to a dumpster behind a restaurant. When I investigated, I found out that she'd been arrested 10 times in the past 4 years. But during that time period, she'd never received any meaningful treatment. And this time, when I found her in the jail, she was there because she had shoved a person at a bus stop. Alice Ann had been walking by the bus stop. She'd seen an elderly woman standing there. She'd looked at her, and the woman exchanged glances, and Alice Ann screamed, "Stop stealing my thoughts!" And she raced up and she shoved the older woman, not hard enough to knock her over, but she shoved her, and then she ran away. Well-meaning witnesses came up and said, "You should have that woman arrested. If you get arrested, she'll get put in jail and she'll get help. Get her arrested." So the woman filed charges. Well, help is not what Alice Ann got. Florida takes its crimes against the elderly very seriously. They are automatic felonies. And because she had shoved 2 other elderly people at bus stops, she was charged under the 3 strikes law, which meant she faced a mandatory 5 years in prison. But when she was taken into court, the judge looked down at her and he saw that she was incompetent. And he said, "I can't put this person on trial because in the United States you have to understand what is going on in order to be put on trial." So he said, "I'm going to send you to Chattahoochee to the state hospital to be made competent." Not treated, made competent. And there's a big difference. Treatment means you actually get some help. And that's not what happened with Alice Ann. Instead, every day she was taken into a room and she was shown 3 chairs. On one chair was the word judge, on the next chair was defense attorney, and on the third chair was prosecutor. And when Alice Ann could tell her keepers who sat in each one of those chairs, she was deemed competent enough to be put on trial, and she was brought back to the jail. Of course, she appeared before the judge. He looked down. He said, "This woman's still not competent. What's going on?" Back to Chattahoochee. They would take her back in the room, back and forth, back and forth. When I found Alice Ann, she had been traveling back and forth 1,151 days, more than 3 years, and she still had never been brought to trial. And I took out my little reporter's notebook and I wrote it all down, and I raced over to the prosecutor and said, "Look what I found, look what I found." And they were not shocked at all. They knew all about Alice Ann. And they told me they were intentionally keeping her shuttling back and forth. Why? Because she was dangerous. Medication didn't seem to help her become stable. And there was no safe place in the entire state of Florida for her to go. So they were keeping her on that bus, shuttling her back and forth. Alice Ann was typical. The kind of inmates I was following, the kind I'm talking about this morning, are not Hannibal Lecter serial killers. They are people who have brain disorders, people with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and major and persistent depression. This summer, I was fortunate enough to testify before the U.S. House Subcommittee on Health. And a 4-member panel of experts, supposedly our government's finest, most brilliant scientists when it comes to mental illness, testified before I did. And every one of them said that our best science now shows that mental illnesses are illnesses. Illnesses. The people who get sick should not be blamed for developing these brain disorders. The heart can get sick, and so can the mind. And according to the National Institutes of Mental Health, 60 to 70% of persons with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and major and persistent depression can be helped with medication. And that recovery percentage can grow even higher if other recovery services are offered to clients. But first, you have to have meaningful community services in place, and then you have to have a way to deliver those services to the people who need them. Consider April Hernandez. She's the same age as my son. And when I met her in prison, in jail there, she was serving 6 months for stealing a car. And when I investigated it, I discovered that the car had actually belonged to her family's relatives. And her own parents had conspired to get their daughter arrested and put into jail. Now, why would parents want their own daughter arrested? Because April had been gang raped twice while she was psychotic and homeless in South Beach. She'd been beaten 3 times by teenagers swinging baseball bats who thought it was hilarious on a Friday night to attack homeless people. And there was nothing her parents could do to intervene because she was an adult and she was not considered an imminent danger. April's mental condition had been masked for years because as a teenager, she had started using drugs, and her parents naturally assumed that it was her drug addiction that was causing her erratic behavior. It was only after she was correctly diagnosed as having co-occurring disorders that they discovered that she had a mental illness. Another prisoner I met was Freddie Gilbert, and every one of us in this room knows or has seen someone like Freddie Gilbert. A Miami study found that in a population of 2 million, on any given day, there are 1,700 people who are living in cars and public shelters or on the streets. They're homeless. But nearly all these people move through the social welfare system and find lodging, except for 507 of them. These 507 are the chronic homeless, and every one of them has a mental illness, and every one of those 507 in Miami has been arrested more than once. Now, Gilbert was one of the 507 chronically mentally ill living in South Beach on the streets when he was picked up for being a public nuisance. He was so sick when I first met him, he could not speak. He stood naked in his cell and he grunted, and the correctional officers controlled him by offering him sandwiches as if he were a dog performing for treats. And when I checked his record, I discovered that Gilbert had been in and out of the Miami jail more than 24 times in the last decade, and he had never received any meaningful treatment or help for his brain disorder. And this was because he was charged with misdemeanors, and in Florida, he could not be forced into a long-term treatment program or required to take his medication. And as a result, he was stuck in a revolving door. 3 days in jail, released to the streets. 2 weeks later, picked back up, put back in jail. 3 days in jail, back to the streets. How did we get into this situation? From a historic perspective, we really have come full circle. In colonial days, people had to depend on their families. Otherwise, they were locked in jails and prisons, or they were warned out, which means the sheriff took them to the county line and warned them to keep walking and told them never to come back. In 1843, activist Dorothea Dix visited a Boston jail to teach a Bible class, and she discovered that people who were lunatics were being kept in a part of the jail that had no heat, despite the freezing temperatures. And when she approached the jailer, he said, "Oh, the crazies? They're not like us. They don't feel the cold. They don't need heat." Now, Dix spent the next 2 decades exposing how persons with mental disorders were being abused at jails and prisons, and she pushed the concept of treatment, not punishment. And she was personally credited with convincing 30 states to build hospitals for caring for persons with mental illnesses. Now, we all know what happened next. Within the next 50 years, many of these state asylums turned into giant, cruel, abusive warehouses. One reporter in Oklahoma in the 60s compared them to Nazi concentration camps. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy heard the cries for reform, and he called on Congress, remember this is in 63, to spend $3 billion to replace the hospital system with a network of community-based mental health centers. The discovery of a promising new drug called Thorazine made it possible for mentally ill persons to return to their hometowns, live outside these locked wards. And Kennedy's plan called for the creation of 2,000 community-based mental health centers. But President Kennedy was assassinated, the Vietnam War escalated, Congress got ensnarled in Watergate. Thorazine turned out not to be quite as wonderful as everyone imagined, and communities were not as welcoming as they should have been. In short, that $3 billion never got spent. Those 2,000 mental health centers never got built. And persons with mental illness, never much of a priority, were simply bumped to a back burner. Next came deinstitutionalization, the closing and the emptying of these dreaded state asylums. And it was an idea that was absolutely fantastic, but it soon turned into a very cruel joke. And this is because states across the nation began shutting down their state asylums without creating any kind of safety net to protect the people who were literally being thrown out the front doors overnight. By 1975, the hospital population in the U.S. had plummeted by 80%. Now, I was surprised when I investigated the history of deinstitutionalization. Most of us think it was done out of kindness, out of concern, out of compassion, out of the realization that these places were horrible, horrible places. But that's not what led to deinstitutionalization. It was all about the money. State legislators, The public was putting pressure on state legislators to repair state hospitals and make them decent places. And civil rights lawyers were filing costly class action suits against the states. And the states were being backed into a corner. And then the federal government, Uncle Sam, came riding in on a white horse, and they announced that persons with mental disabilities would be made eligible for federal programs such as Medicaid, but only if they didn't live in the state asylums. And as soon as Congress announced that it would begin taking care of persons with mental disabilities, the states went yippee, and they began shutting down the state hospitals. If you look at population tables as I have, you'll see as the population in state mental hospitals goes shooting down, the population in jails and prisons go shooting up. And what of Uncle Sam's promises? How has the federal government kept its promise to take care of persons with mental illnesses? It didn't react fast enough to get community services into place. And with nowhere to go, former asylum patients simply move from the state hospitals across the street to jails and prisons. Now, while deinstitution made a huge difference in filling up our jails and prisons and making them our new asylums, it's not the only reason. In the 1980s, civil rights attorneys stopped the police from arresting someone simply because they were mentally ill. And that was a good thing, because being sent to an asylum at the time was often the equivalent of a life prison sentence. Being mentally ill shouldn't be a crime. And the civil rights attorneys also stopped hospitals from forcing persons to undergo lobotomies and other so-called treatments against their will. And most of all, and they made no effort to hide this, civil rights attorneys targeted commitment laws. They wanted to make it nearly impossible to get people involuntarily committed into these horrible, dreaded state hospitals. And the key language became imminent danger, and having set that standard, they made sure it was narrowly interpreted. One judge ruled that a defendant with a long history of chronic schizophrenia who was living under a car and eating his own feces was not considered an imminent danger because neither of those acts was life-threatening. In my opinion, these tough commitment laws that were originally intended to protect persons from being unfairly locked up are now being used by many states to deny persons services in order to save money. Persons such as my son are being refused treatment until they violate the law, even if they have a long history of mental illness and are helped by medication. The tragedy at Virginia Tech has focused new attention on when should we intervene? When do we intervene? But this debate often is argued in the extremes. Changing imminent danger does not mean that you are in favor of stripping away a person's civil rights. In recent years, 23 states have changed and expanded their commitment laws to add a need for treatment. In North Dakota, language was added to consider if there's been a substantial deterioration in mental health. Missouri is among the ones that have chosen to broaden their law for modifying imminent danger. Your law requires a person to show a, quote, likelihood of serious harm to self or others, or two, a substantial risk that serious physical harm will result due to an impairment in capacity to make treatment decisions, evidenced by an inability to provide for basic necessities of food, clothing, shelter, safety, medical care, or necessary mental health care. Evidence may also be included to show past behaviors of past patterns of behavior. I especially appreciate that last clause. Evidence may also include past patterns of behavior, because that is not allowed in Virginia. The Virginia governor's panel that investigated the murders at Virginia Tech has recommended that Virginia drop its imminent danger criteria and actually change its law to be very similar to yours. The panel said, quote, using imminent danger makes it difficult, if not impossible, to treat someone before they have harmed themselves or others. The National Alliance on Mental Illness goes a step further. It says current interpretations of laws that require proof of dangerousness often produce unsatisfactory outcomes because individuals are allowed to deteriorate needlessly before involuntary commitment and or court-ordered treatment can be instituted. When the dangerousness statute is used, it must be interpreted more broadly than imminently dangerous. Yet, the imminently dangerous, danger to self or others criteria is still the most widely used criteria across America. I love my son, and I want his civil rights protected. And I know how horribly we have treated persons with mental disorders in this country, and we have to be careful when we change commitment criteria, but it does not do either an ill person or society any good to tell a father to bring back his son after he tries to kill himself or he tries to kill you. We walk by sick people every day on our streets, and we pick up our pace and we avoid them by saying, well, as long as they're not hurting me or someone else. Well, that works until you're the parent, until that's your son, until that's one of your loved ones, or until that person is you. We must find a more humane way of helping people. Our jails and our prisons have become our new asylums for another reason. Initially, managed care was supposed to make health care affordable to everyone. But by 1997, 2/3 of HMOs are now controlled by for-profit companies. And as a result, acute care psychiatric beds for helping people who are in crisis are virtually being closed down across this nation. These beds aren't profitable. Surgical beds are. So psychiatric beds are being shut down and replaced with surgical beds. In Northern Virginia, where I live, 24% of the psychiatric acute care beds were shut down in 1 year, 2005. And meanwhile, states are closing down their state asylums because we want to treat people in our community. And we're shutting down beds in our communities. And the result is a complete lack of beds for people in crisis. A University of Virginia professor estimates in the next 12 months in my home state, more than 2,400 persons who are in acute crisis will not be admitted to a psychiatric facility simply because of a lack of beds. And of those 475 persons who meet the top imminent danger criteria will be released to the streets completely untreated because there's nowhere for them to go. That's shameful. So it's these events, deinstitutionalization without any kind of community services, our government's ongoing failure to adequately fund community mental health services, overly restricted commitment criteria, and reductions in psychiatric beds that are causing our jails and prisons to begin bursting at the seams with persons, many of whom only real crime is they got sick. How are we responding to this crisis? We have turned mental illness from a health problem into a criminal justice problem. Communities are spending millions to expand jails and prisons. They're replacing the dreaded ninth floors with modern lockdown prisons with diagnostic centers for inmates with severe mental problems. And I am glad that we're shutting down places like the ninth floor, but creating better diagnostic facilities in jails and prisons is not the answer. We should not require a person who has a brain disorder to commit a crime in order for him to get medical treatment and services. Getting arrested should not be the first step in getting treatment, and that is where we're going in this country. I spoke a few months ago in Alabama, and before I talked, one of their top mental health persons in the entire state kept bragging about how jails and prisons were the new gateway to treatment. He identified jails as where people needed to go to get into the continuum of care. That's wrong. Because of our current crisis, several cities have set up mental health courts and jail diversion programs to stop the flow of persons with brain disorders into jails and prisons. And I applaud these efforts. They are wonderful. They make sense. They're necessary. But there's a lesson we should have learned from deinstitutionalization that we seem to have forgotten. Diverting a person from jail is wonderful if that community has somewhere to divert them to. If there are no meaningful treatment or recovery programs, no access to affordable medication, no acute or long-term hospital beds, no housing, no peer-to-peer support, no therapy, no jobs, no assertive community access teams, and no help for recovery, then what are we accomplishing? Improving and broadening community-based health services is where we should be focusing our tax dollars, not in building new and better jails. We need to fund early screening and early mental health intervention programs so we can help people while they're young. We need to put money behind peer-to-peer support, drop-in centers, clubhouses, and job programs. Every community in America should have a crisis intervention-trained police department and crisis intervention-trained correctional officers. And we especially need to find decent housing in our communities. Put simply, we need to provide persons with mental disorders a variety and a full range of treatment that can meet their individual needs and help them recover. Or to be blunt, we need to turn mental illness back into a health issue where medical professionals take the lead, rather than continuing to make it a criminal justice problem. People say to me, oh, what's the answer? Oh, the problem of mental illness is just so big and complicated. We'll never solve it. And I say, bull. Look around. There are many, many successful programs in our nation. Since the publication of my book, I have visited 26 states. In Denver, I saw a successful drop-in center where people with chronic brain disorders were being helped and recruited into community treatment. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, I saw a fabulous jobs program based on the Fountain House model in New York. And the NAMI in Delaware actually owns apartments and rents them out to persons with mental illnesses. The city of San Diego saved $1.7 million last year by creating a crisis intervention team in the police department. A mental health program in Washington State uses assertive community treatment to pluck people out of asylums and move them back into the community. People do get better. People do recover if they're given a chance. I found a program in Miami that was doing the seemingly impossible. It was taking people, convicted felons, mostly murderers, out of prison and helping them move back into the Miami community. Now, how is that possible? Especially since most of these people had chronic schizophrenia, the worst mental illness. How is that possible? The program was called Passageway, and at Passageway, every resident got individual help that he or she needed to succeed. Residents worked with doctors to get the right medicines that truly helped them. They weren't given the cheapest drug. Doctors worked with them to find the right combination of medicines with as few side effects as possible. And the doctors at Passageway took time to get to know their patients. They didn't simply evaluate, medicate, and vacate them out the door. They listened to them. At Passageway, clients were assigned jobs based on their skills and ability. It didn't matter if it was wiping down a table after lunch or working a 40-hour-a-week job. Jobs give you a sense of self-worth. At Passageway, clients participated in peer-to-peer support classes. Why? Because helping other people helps you. They were given group therapy. They received excellent case management. They were encouraged to go to school. They were encouraged to pursue their dreams. They were encouraged to have dreams. And when they were well enough, they were encouraged to manage and take control of their own treatment. Clients were given housing, too. Having a safe place to live is essential to recovery. But most of all, they were given hope. They were told they could get better, and they did. Many, many of them did. Tom Mullen, the program's director, told me the secret of his program, and it proved to be incredibly simple. He had created a real asylum, not a giant warehouse out in the boondocks where people were locked up and forgotten, but a community where people genuinely cared about one another. The residents of Passageway became a family, or in his words, a parish, where persons with mental illnesses were not stigmatized, not isolated, not shunned, but were truly accepted as valuable members of our society. What Passageway did can be duplicated elsewhere with these basic fundamentals: access to meaningful medical and psychotherapy treatment, individualized treatment, good case management, jobs or tasks suited to ability, peer-to-peer support, empowerment, housing, acceptance and human dignity of value, and hope. While we must always do everything we can to help people recover from their illness, we must also realize that sometimes these illnesses are just too strong. At the NAMI convention in San Diego this summer, Dr. Tom Insel, the director of the National Institutes of Mental Health, said mental illnesses, like cancer, sometimes are too strong. Some people do not recover, and we need to be mindful of this. And that's why long-term treatment facilities must be factored into our overall network. Of course, we must always help people live with the fewest restrictions possible in our communities, but we must also understand that some people are so ill they need extended care. So you see, we know how to provide help to many, many people with brain disorders. The question is, will we do it? And that brings us back to money. Let's return to Miami. Not everyone with a mental disorder there is locked up in the jail or prison. Some 4,500 persons are living in what's called assisted living facilities, boarding homes, 650 of them in Miami. These are people who would have been in an institution, but now they're in these boarding homes. which is great. They're in the local community. But let's look at these boarding homes. Only 250 of them can pass the state's minimum licensing requirements to stay open. In other words, if we had anybody there except someone with a mental illness, they would have been shut down. Only 250. 400 have failed to meet those minimal standards. That's 2/3 of them. One of the group homes I visited had a hole in the roof. Water was pouring through. Medications were scattered on a kitchen table. The caretaker only spoke Spanish. None of the tenants spoke Spanish. There were no job programs. There was no therapy. There was nothing to do but watch TV and smoke cigarettes. Meals were rice and beans. Case managers never visited. In this incident, we really haven't improved these people's lives by taking them out of institutions. We're simply hiding them better. Now, it's easy for journalists to criticize the owners of these slum houses, but let's dig a little further. The operator of a boarding home, an ALF in Miami, receives $29.90 per day for every resident who lives there. This includes money from the resident's Social Security check and state funding and Medicaid. By comparison, when the federal government sends an employee to Miami, the per diem rate that he receives for food and lodging is $203 per day, or 7 times more. But let's bring that a little closer to my home. When I travel on trips like this, I board my dog at the Dulles Executive Pet Center, and it charges me $31 a day to board, feed, dispense medication, and give my dog a 15-minute walk. In other words, this kennel charges $1 more per day to take care of my dog than what we are paying people in Miami to take care of persons with chronic mental disorders. I live in Fairfax County, Virginia. It brags it's one of the wealthiest counties in the United States. Yet there is a 2-week wait to get into a treatment program, a 6-month wait to get a case manager, an 18-year wait to get into any kind of housing. Is it any wonder that I call my book crazy? I'm not talking about people like my son. I'm talking about our system. I will not pretend to be an expert on what is happening in Missouri, but I did read the NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, Grading the States report, and your state received a C-. Now that actually was a fairly high mark in that report. And NAMI gave you some high marks. It said you're excellent when it comes to pro-recovery approach, saying that other states need to follow your example. It said Missouri leads the nation in oversight of clinical prescription practices, and it praised Missouri for passing insurance parity. It also said you've worked hard to decriminalize persons with mental disorders. You've introduced CIT and jail diversion programs. That's great. You've accomplished much. But NAMI also warned that your state legislators have undercut your system by pounding it repeatedly with budget cuts, eliminating muscle and bone rather than simply trimming fats, and, quote, causing needless suffering and early deaths. It specifically said that Missouri faces shortages in housing, acute care beds, and community alternatives to hospital care. And it warned, quite frankly, that solving these problems is going to require money. We must begin putting money where our hearts should be. People say to me, oh, what you want is unrealistic. It would cost too much. It would cost too much to provide the treatment that you're demanding. And I reply, oh, really? Well, guess what? We're wasting millions. And you know what we're getting in return? Nothing. The 3 of the 6 floors that hold prisoners in Miami are used exclusively to house 1,200 persons who have severe psychiatric disorders. The city pays $100,000 per day, or $36 million per year, simply to warehouse and medicate those 1,200, not treat them. For $12 million, the city could assign an assertive community treatment team to each of those individuals, and for another $6 million, it could provide them with decent housing, or for a total of $18 million, half of what they're spending now, they could help people recover. Like all parents, I thought my son would be different. I thought Mike would get better. I thought this was just a phase. I thought we'd move on with our lives. And my son did great. For 2 years while I was on probation, he did fabulous. He got a job. He became Employee of the Month. He was doing swell. And then, as soon as his probation ended, he stopped taking his medication. We argued about it. I tried to understand. I didn't. We argued more and more and more, and I was watching my son slip down that slope. Fairfax County has a mobile crisis response team, and I called it. And I told him my son was off his medication. I said, let me tell you about his past. And they said, stop. The past does not predict the future. You can't blame your son for something that he's done in the past, assuming he's going to do it again. I said, would you tell that to a heart patient? And the guy almost hung up, and he said, look, you know the rules. Call us when your son becomes dangerous. On the night my son became violent, on the night I didn't have to lie, I called that very same dispatcher and I said, my son is violent. I need your help. Please come over. And he said, your son's violent? I said, yes. He said, call the police. We don't come if someone's violent. The police came, and my son Mike was shot twice with a taser, hogtied, and taken away. Now, if I couldn't get my son help after spending 3 years investigating our system, and with my education, with my money, with my political connections, then what chance does someone who has no knowledge of the system, has no money, has no education, has no political connections, what chance is somebody who's poor, what chance do they have in getting through our mental health system? Since that horrible incident, Mike has done much better. He's been stable for the last 14 months. He's been helped by a case manager, which is fantastic because I can just be the father. When he was refused a full-time job because of his criminal record, he took 2 part-time ones. And he has refused and gets angry when people refer to him by his diagnosis. He is more than someone who is bipolar. So don't call him that. And I'm proud of him. I've talked today, this morning, about the overwhelming problems that I saw that we face with the criminalization of persons with mental disorders. But there are reasons to be hopeful. There are many reasons to be hopeful. And one of the reasons I am hopeful is because of you. You're sitting right here today. You've had enough interest. You have enough concern to come. Many of you are healthcare professionals who've been dedicated your life to helping others. And that gives me hope. I grew up in Oklahoma. My father is now a retired minister. And you guys are close enough to Oklahoma to know what that means. That means that every Wednesday night, every Saturday, and at least 2 times on Sunday, I got dragged to church. And I'm going to tell you a story my father told, and I'm not going to tell it to you because I'm trying to convert you. I'm trying to tell you this story because the moral significance and the imagery of it. Now, I must tell you that oftentimes when I was sitting in church, I got real good at sleeping with my eyes shut. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention, but this story always snapped me to. And that's because I was a teenager, and the story involves a prostitute. Now, you might remember that story. A woman is caught in adultery. She's dragged into the center of the community, and people pick up stones. They're going to stone her. They're going to kill her because of what she's done. And Jesus says, let ye who has never sinned cast that first stone. And one by one, the people drop the rocks. They drop the stones because they realize that none of them are innocent. None of them are pure. All of them have sinned, and they walk away. Sadly, we live in a world today where people don't put down those rocks. They don't put down the stones they've snatched up. They're quick to condemn people who are different, people who don't fit in, people who have mental disorders or co-occurring problems. They're afraid of them. They want to drive them away. They want to stone them. They want to lock them up. They want them out of their communities. As healthcare providers, as persons who care about people who are ill, I believe you have chosen to become stone catchers, to become people who step between those who want to throw rocks and those who can't defend themselves. You're called on to protect and help persons who are sick until they can join us in protecting others. And it's the stone catchers in our society who give me hope. What can you do? You can speak out. I am outraged. I am outraged that not one presidential candidate so far has said one word about what they want to do when it comes to our mental health system. Not one. After the killings at Virginia Tech, after 33 bodies dead, you would think this would be a national priority. Yet in Virginia, the only comment that politicians have made when the Virginia Tech murders come up is how we need gun control. People say that persons with mental illnesses don't matter because they don't vote. Well, guess what? I vote. And 1 of every 4 families in this nation, that means 1/4 of the people in this room have someone in their family with a serious mental illness. It's time for us to speak out loudly and passionately and forcefully to demand reform. Lives are at stake. My son has a mental illness. To me, this cruel disease wears his face, and I will ever be grateful to people like you, people who can be stone catchers, who can look beyond the madness in his eyes and see a human being who has a father, a mother, and people who love him. So thank you. Thank you for being a stone catcher. Thank you for speaking out. Thank you for coming today to listen to me. Thank you for demanding reforms. You will change lives. Thank you.
We're going to ask Mr. Earley to stay for a few questions. If you have any, think those up and be ready to ask them. I'll apologize, but I'm going to do another plug of the book. It's Crazy, A Father's Search Through America's Mental Health Madness. It's published by Berkeley Books, and in 2006. So it's, again, I highly recommend it. So we'll take questions here.
And I'll stay only if you call me Pete, please. Okay. I know I'm older than you, but it makes me feel ancient here. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
I'll trigger your hot button. What about Oklahoma and the lady that came to Missouri to acquire a baby that she claimed to have birthed and now in the court system? You don't know about it?
I don't. Sorry. I'm ignorant. I haven't read my newspaper. I'm not up on that. You'll have to give me a little more help. I'm sorry.
It's a lady that wanted to have a baby, and she obviously has mental health problem, and through email, I think it was. I can't tell you the whole story. I haven't followed it real closely. But anyway, she came to Missouri. A girl was pregnant, killed the mother, took the baby from her womb, and the baby survived, went back to Oklahoma, and then they were hot enough on the trail that they found her. But she's taken to court, and it's the question now, they've decided she's guilty, and the question is,
Okay.
does she get put to death, or does she spend life in jail?
All right, I understand what your question is. Thank you for asking that. Unfortunately, these incidents are not rare. According to the Treatment Advocacy Center, 3 people a week die needlessly. They're either killed, they're either an untreated person with mental illness who kills someone, they're either a police officer who kills a person with mental illness, or they're a person with untreated mental illness who kills a family member. And they're tragic. Now, I'm not sure what you're asking me. Are you asking me is because they are psychotic, should we hold them responsible or not? The courts think that they should be. I personally do not. I think if you look at the death penalty, you will find there are a number of cases, one down in Texas where a person believed that everyone was an alien and he killed a police officer, which is very typical. There's 250 people on death row right now who have chronic schizophrenia. And the courts ruled that because he ran away, he knew the difference between right and wrong. And even though he is clearly psychotic, no question about it, has a long history of schizophrenia, he should be put to death because he was cognizant enough to leave the scene. I think that's a pitiful standard. I think if someone is sick, if someone has a brain disorder, if someone like my son who breaks into a house to take a bubble bath, then I think you have to factor that in. Does that mean that I think people with untreated mental illness are not dangerous? Of course not. I have seen my son violent. He's been violent with me, and it's like looking at a stranger. The question is then, what do you do about that? And my argument is you don't wait to let them get to that stage. You step in. One of the things you've done in Missouri, which makes sense, we can't do in Virginia. I can't go in and say, my son has a history of mental illness. He's been hospitalized 4 times. All right? This is what happens when he is off his medication. Please do something. You apparently can do that in Missouri. I think that makes sense. We try to get, I want to lower the commitment standard, make it more common sense, to get people into treatment, and then provide the treatment to get them the help they need. And I think that's the answer I'm looking for. Will there still be incidents like that? Perhaps. I don't know. Other questions? Don't be shy. Thanks for asking that. Remember, I'm from Washington, so I'm pretty good at dodging questions, too. Yes?
What states have successful prison programs that help rehabilitate these individuals?
She'd asked me what states have good programs that help rehabilitate people. Ohio has done some remarkable things. And the trick is to try to get people before they get in those situations and then try to help them when they get out. Look, people with mental illnesses who go to prison will get out. And you're foolish if you think that when they hit the streets, they're not going to be psychotic again if you don't provide them with help. But it's really tough to get help for people who have been arrested and in prison because everybody's afraid of them. They don't want to deal with them. And the most disenfranchised people, I would argue, in this nation are people with mental illnesses because we're scared of them. Now, why are we scared of them? Here's my little psychology 101, and I'm not a psychologist, so I apologize to all of you. But we walk by people, and we see them on the street, we see them homeless, we see them dirty, we see them ranting and raving, and deep down, we want to believe they want to be that way, or they've done something to deserve it. We don't want to believe it's an illness, because if we believe that, if you truly believe when you walk through the 9th floor that that could be you, it's terrifying. And so we don't want to believe that. So we say, oh, they must deserve that, you know. But Ohio, there are a number. This is what's so frustrating to me. As I've traveled, there are many, many good programs out there. There are ways to help people. But you've got to spend the money, and you've got to create the climate to get those people help. And we just aren't willing to do that. In Delaware right now, Delaware has one of the hardest, toughest commitment language on the books. It's really, really tough to get anybody committed in Delaware. And you know why? They're trying to make it even tougher. It has nothing to do with protecting people's civil rights. It has everything to do with the state saying, we don't want to pay for their involuntary commitment. And if we commit them, we have to pay for it. If they just walk in, their insurance pays for it. And that's what it's about. It's about money. Also, you should realize, many of you may not know this, in Virginia, commitment means you've passed the criteria, you get committed, and locally it's 6 days. In the state facility, if you're really, really sick, in our 2 last remaining hospital, it's 45. So it's very tough to, and what we've done is because we've done away with any long-term facilities. I got a call yesterday while I was coming here from a woman, and we have, these are so common of what I run into. Someone who was institutionalized, who's out on the street, who can't live anywhere, is not getting any kind of services, doesn't feel like they've been traumatized by their earlier history, will not cooperate with anything, and they're roaming the streets, and no one wants to provide them with any kind of help because these are people who nobody wants to help. Your community mental health center is usually not set up to help that kind of person, so they constantly just in and out of jail, in and out of jail. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry. At one point, I was a physician at a county jail, and one of the challenges that we saw, not only with mental health issues, but with other individuals with chronic health care problems that were costly to treat, was that when they entered the jail system, they lost their Medicaid coverage.
Right. Perfect. You're
and
absolutely right.
The cost at that point of continuing a lot of the very expensive mental health medications or medications for HIV or any other chronic condition that was costly to treat was more than could be afforded. And it put an incredible strain on the budget. I mean, it was a real problem. Right. We could track the cost when SSRIs began being used. It was just phenomenal how the medication costs went up.
Right.
It seems critical to me that there has to be some kind of it's a very piecemeal system where someone can be in Medicaid, outside, be institutionalized, lose their Medicaid, be put on a cheaper antidepressant or no medication, become uncontrolled, then be released. Get in more trouble
in jail.
And then when they leave the jail, they have to reapply for Medicaid.
Right.
And it's a long process. I have someone right now who it's been 2 years since they left jail, and we have not been able to get him back on Medicaid again. He's homeless. And so it's a huge challenge. And as providers, I guess I'm curious if you've seen any system
have.
that works that's more comprehensive and less piecemeal.
I'm jumping out of my shoes. I'm going to come down there and give you a big hug because you have just hit one of the nails right on the head. First of all, in Miami jail, they have a fail first, which means the first thing that comes in is they take you off your meds and they put you on their cheapest one, which was Risperdal, because they had a contract and they were wooed by that pharmaceutical company to provide it. So if you were on Zyprexa or Abilify, man, all of a sudden, boom, you're on that. Second point I want to make is, and then I'll answer your question, the people driving the cause to get people out in jails and prisons are not mental health providers. They're not doctors. They're not, although NAMI wants to do it. The biggest advocates for getting people out of jail right now are the law enforcement. Now, eventually that's going to change because law enforcement is going to realize they can build new institutions, get more people, blah, blah, blah. But they don't like them in there, and the reason is exactly what you said, is medication cost. The cost of medications at a jail is phenomenal, so that's driving it. Ironically, after my book came out, Miami really got it together when it came to that very serious problem. And what they've done is they've instituted the very first gap funding. They got a whole lot of money from the state, and what happens is you lose your Medicaid, you go in. There it was taking 6 to 9 months to get your check. But when you got that check, it was retroactive. Now, how smart was it to give somebody with a co-occurring mental illness 6 to 9 months after they've been released from jail and have had no money, a check for $6,000 saying this is all your... You know where that went. It didn't go for housing or whatever. So what they do is they provide instantly, when the person gets out of jail, from this pool of money, they provide services. They link them, they get them in. Then that check then goes back to the pool rather than to the individual when they finally qualify for Medicaid. And it's just, this is the first year they're doing it, and it makes sense. Other states have fought to make sure you don't lose Medicaid funding while you're in jail, but it's really, really tough, especially if you're a felony. And this gentleman earlier with his question hit it right on the head. Look, I can get up here and I can get some sympathy because my son broke in to take a bubble bath. It gets tougher when you've chopped off somebody's arms or you've murdered your parent and eaten them, you know. And that's the kind of horrendous crimes that happen that people have very little sympathy, and it increases the stigma and the fear. That's a little thought I added on. But thank you for asking that question because look, you know, I've spent all this time researching this, and I've learned what I knew when I went to Washington in '78, follow the money. And that will give the answer to a lot of these. And we just don't want to spend the kind of money, or we're spending it stupidly in ways like this that do not create good recovery methods. Thank you for your question. Sure.
I'm curious if you have any ideas on how we're going to change attitudes in this country about mental illness. I did crisis intervention for years, and I would see heart patients come into the ER after they had had open heart surgery, they had had rehab, they were not taking their medication, they were not complying with exercise and diet, and I would see them admitted over and over and over. Mental health patient would come in not compliant with their medication, and nobody wanted to look at that as a physical issue. And I don't know, I don't know what it's going to take to change the attitudes so that people begin to look at it as an illness, just like a cardiovascular disease, just like a diabetes in terms of treatment.
All right, thank you. Well, because it's with our mind, we treat it differently, as you know, and there's a tremendous amount of stigma. And so you fight that, I think, with education. I think you fight it. I had 2 reasons to write this book. One was I wanted to put a human face on it. This happened to my son. This happened to me in my nice little suburban life in Washington, D.C., where I thought my life was just going along just swimmingly, you know. It can strike anyone. Second, jails and prisons are not good places for persons with mental disorders. So you try to hit that, to try to make it aware. You know, it mystifies me. 1 in 4 families have someone with a severe mental illness. That's a huge political force. That's 25%, and yet we're reluctant to talk about it. People get on airplanes, they tell me, I was reading your book, but I took the cover off. You know, we still make fun of people who have mental illnesses. So we know the stigma's out there. I think you fight it by making it clear to your legislators. I think you fight it by having groups like NAMI and Mental Health America go to newspapers and write stories about this kind of stuff. and talk about the need for treatment. There's lots of stories out there like this gentleman mentioned. Once your eyes are open to this, it's shocking how many stories every day in the paper you'll read about someone with an untreated mental illness. I think we have to be realistic about our laws. And we have to realize that according to a recent Vermont study, 50% of persons who were in crisis with mental illness did not believe they were ill. And we have to step up to the plate. Look, my son, I think you have to use some common sense. And I know it's easier to do the rhetoric than to put it in practice because these are tough issues. But my son does not believe that 9/11 was caused by Al-Qaeda. He thinks it was caused by George Bush. I don't have a problem with that. Okay? He wants to believe that, that's fine. But when he's sitting in front of a TV with tinfoil wrapped around his head and he's been hospitalized 4 times before and we know medication works, then I don't think we should have to wait for him to hurt himself or hurt me or do something really stupid and get arrested before I should be able to go in and say, hey, look, here's the history, here's what's going on. He needs help. So there are advanced directives, there are other things we're trying to do, but we need to face the facts on when are we going to draw that line, when are we going to intervene. But I guess I've dodged your question, but education, speaking out, I would love to have. We, chose the face of mental illness right now, the killer at Virginia Tech. Mike Wallace has been great. Patty Duke's also the face. Patrick Kennedy is the face. But it'd be nice to have, a Tom Hanks or somebody like that, but people are just scared. So, yes, sir. Last question, right? Or are we done?
I think we're done.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Pete. And,
thank you very much.